Hello, and welcome to my summary and commentary of Part 4 of the Introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, Volume 1. This is a very important and great section. There's three pretty important things going on here. First, Spengler lays out a little bit more his dichotomy between nature and history. Next, he poses the very interesting question, for whom is there history? And the corollary of this question, as he answers it, is that there are ahistoric and historic peoples, and historic peoples would only be peoples who belong to a high culture that has a historic spirit, and the examples of those would be Egypt, as you can tell by things like the pyramids, mummification, things like that, the Faustian soul, the Western man, which are essentially two things to say two ways of saying the same thing. So you've got Egyptian, Western. Magian also has a world history conception that we'll get to a few sections from now in this introduction. And the Chinese culture also has a historical conception, whereas the classical and the Indian are kind of ahistoric souls, even though they are high cultures. And for Spengler, someone who doesn't belong to a high culture, and even someone who belongs to a culture that used to be a high culture, what he'll later in Volume 2 go on to define as Fellaheen people, Fellaheen, which I'll have spelled somewhere in the description below for you. But these are peoples that they had a high culture, but in the spring, summer, autumn, winter progression that Spengler has, by winter they became a civilization, and eventually they were either conquered by somebody else, almost always conquered by somebody else, and in his view, they become an ahistoric people after this. So it's pretty interesting. So he poses this question, for whom is their history? And that's the second very important and interesting part of Section 4, Part 4 of the introduction. And then finally, the third is that we get our first introduction to his comparative morphology in action. So to answer the question, for whom is their history, he's going to get into a fairly in-depth morphology of the classical culture. And that's very interesting as he compares it to some of the other high cultures that he posits. Moving on to the first point now. So, nature versus history, he continues to flesh out this dichotomy. And he says, nature synthesizes and interprets the immediate impression of the senses for the man of higher cultures. So this is interesting because he's also positing that each culture has its own nature, and we could view nature thinking as scientific thinking broadly. I think in terms of colloquial English, axiomatic American English, or idiomatic American English, excuse me, nature in Spengler's conception is going to best translate to scientific, systematic, something like that. But I think just translating it as science is going to give you almost everything. But he thinks that each culture has its own science, essentially, because nature is what looks into physics and chemistry. Now, because of Spengler's very odd way of distinguishing biology from the other sciences, I think it's fairly odd. Now, obviously, he's not the first. It's Goethe who starts this, so fair enough. But at the same time, in Goethe's day, Darwin hadn't come around, and other things hadn't come around. In our day, of course, after Spengler, we've got Francis Crick and James Watson DNA. We actually have a material means for genetic transmission of information. So anyway, I just think it's very important that he says that nature is the way that the man of higher culture synthesizes and interprets immediate impressions of his senses. So he's also limiting nature to epistemological study, observation of what the sense impressions give for you. And this also ties into his cultural relativity, which is really going to be fleshed out in a few sections later in this introduction, I believe section 8 especially. So that's also interesting, and he opposes this with history once again, which is a comprehension of living existence in relation to one's own life. So history for him has an inherently self-centered aspect to it. I think that's the best way to put it. It's inherently self-focused. History is how you comprehend living existence in relation to your own life, as opposed to nature, which is you're trying to be very empirical, very objective. And he thinks that every culture has these two forms of knowledge, or two forms of gaining knowledge, two significant key methods, in his view, maybe the only methods for gaining knowledge about the world. And he says history invests one's own life with a deeper reality. So this is why these kind of historic cultures and historic souls, they look to the past, they look to the future. This gives the deeper reality that he speaks of here, because you're looking at events as they relate to yourself. And I think it's fairly intuitive that, yeah, that would invest them with a deeper reality. I think everyone can intuit that on little self-reflection. Maybe you've got some devil's advocate, but I don't see much to quibble with there. And he says, whether nature or history dominates one's waking conscience is a primordial problem of all human existence. So he thinks every thinker kind of either, well, he dominates one's waking consciousness, so that's, fairly emphatic language. But so he thinks that each thinker either leans heavily towards the systematic or leans heavily towards the analogical, and he thinks far too many have leaned too heavily towards the systematic. And he's probably right about that with, these German idealists, and they're kind of, but at the same time, they're very anti-empirical. So it's interesting how he lumps this all together, because he lumps kind of analytical philosophy in the tradition of somebody like Immanuel Kant together with physics and chemistry on the one hand, and then he splits that completely from this other world of knowledge where he puts history and biology primarily, and then maybe his form of psychology, but he also will denigrate or make fun of psychologists and other social scientists or people he doesn't think are quite up to snuff. But he also makes fun of other historians, so that, is wholly consistent with his other behavior, excuse me. On to the second main point of this discussion. For whom is there, for whom is there history? So we've got historic versus ahistoric man, as I introduced at the beginning of this video. And what makes someone historic is that he has the constant impression that his life is an element in a far wider life course. So this gives either a man or a culture its sense of history, and this is what creates a historic person. And this is, fairly metaphysical, fairly artistic, fairly poetic, in a way that, maybe a lot of English-speaking intellectuals wouldn't find to be the most comfortable, matter. But I find it very thought-provoking, and I think it is a very just an interesting thought. This isn't something that we can verify empirically, and Spengler, to his credit, by splitting up the world as nature and history, he's admitting that he can't verify this empirically in his way, because he's saying that empirical verification, that's only a nature understanding. That's world as nature. But his system, this is world as history. And so he can ask this question, for whom is there history, even though it's not something that's going to lead to a falsifiable hypothesis. And I'm with him here completely. I think this is a very interesting question, and he goes about answering it in an interesting manner. So he says, In order to answer this question, he needs to do every kind of psychological comparison of foreign cultures and times. So whether it's, people in different places today or people from the past, because he views the classical culture as just as alien to the Western culture as any other culture. In fact, more so than many other cultures. So there's that, and then, obviously places that are foreign to you when you live. So he wants to really penetrate the psychology of these people that are alien to him, these people that are foreign to him. And he wants to do this so that it will yield insight into the soul of the culture as a whole. So a tall task, but a very interesting task to undertake. And now he begins the task by discussing the classical culture, which he says is an example of an ahistoric spirit. And he contrasts this with the Western strong sense of time distances. He thinks the Western is one of the most historic cultures. So even though historic versus ahistoric is, at some point there's a binary there, within these two binaries, he does see a continuum with cultures like the Egyptian and the Western being particularly historic, particularly focused on both the past and the future, and then the classical, and then as we'll see, the Indian, both being ahistoric, but the Indian being the most absolutely ahistoric, or the most superlatively ahistoric soul in Spengler's framework of world history. So he goes on to say that there's a pure present in the classical conception of time, and by this he means that all of the past is contrasted with the present completely. Or, well, that's part of it. Obviously, the pure present, there's kind of a, kind of a yoga aspect to it, I guess you could say, or a meditation. Obviously, there's that, the Stoic aspect, and all these other Greek schools of thought. But he means it also in this polar sense, where he's going to talk about different historical schemes. Some are polar and some are periodic. His is periodic as well, but there's a lot of periodic histories that he also opposes. Now, you could probably further distinguish those between cyclical periodic and then kind of phasic, linear periodic schemes. And he'll get into that much more. So what happens for the classical civilization in his mind is that once an event is past, it could just be 10 years past or anywhere past the lifetimes of the people discussing it, it becomes part of a timeless, immobile, mythically fashioned background for everything going on at that time. So they've lost all sense of the texture to the past, of any sort of continuous stream of events. It's just all this mythological background for what they're doing. Even very shortly after those events have occurred, they already take on a mythical cast, and they're contrasted with the present in a polarity, and there's no sense that the present is really developing into anything or that we need to leave our traces down for posterity, as we'll see as Spengler brings in more and more evidence. So he says the greatest symbol of the pure present of the classical soul is the Doric column, which predicates negation of time. Now, I have no idea what he really means with this, and I've looked at Doric columns and everything. I mean, I just don't know. But, I'm no art historian, clearly. But, so it's just interesting that he calls this the greatest symbol of the pure present. This is the weakest bit of evidence I think he brings, just because I think it's very ambiguous evidence as applied to this conclusion. But he brings a lot of better evidence after this, so we can enjoy that. So he says the Western past is definitely periodic and is a definitely periodic and purposeful organism. So most of these Western views of the past, it's going to be this ancient, medieval, modern scheme where the modern is almost like this redemptive event, or this kind of like new utopia. So obviously he's winking at a lot of German philosophers there, Hegel, Herder, Marx, and others that he'll speak about in some later sections. So he contrasts, again, the classical sense of time with the Egyptian eternity sense. Sorry, I need to pause there for a second. So the eternity sense of the Egyptians and the Babylonians is contrasted with the classical culture. And this is especially important piece of evidence because their astronomical knowledge already existed when the classical culture was developing, and they really rejected it. And there were also a few really great astronomers in the Hellenistic period by the names of Aristarchus and Hipparchus, and they had a lot of interesting, heliocentric views of the world, for one, and views of astronomy. I forget exactly the details. I looked it up the other day. I'm sorry about that, but things that would lead one to have a more unlimited view, a more infinite view of the world, whereas the Greeks, or the classical culture, more properly said, kind of have this ahistoric view, and they also have this view that also wants to shun distance very much. So they don't like distances of time or distances of space. And Spengler marshals a lot of evidence for that. So their rejection of Egyptian and Babylonian astronomical knowledge, I think, is a pretty good piece of evidence. Also, the fact that the heliocentric view of the solar system and other astronomical findings of Aristarchus and Hipparchus were not taken up and didn't have any real influence on the culture at large. Now, maybe part of that is they're already pretty much into their civilization phase at that point, so how much can they get really good new scientific knowledge? I'm not really sure. Certainly before that phase in the culture, they would be developing scientific knowledge a lot, but I think Spengler thinks scientific knowledge should still develop pretty well into the civilization phase, particularly technical knowledge or knowledge that's related to finance and economics, things of that nature. And finally, but another piece of really interesting evidence on the astronomy front is that during the Peloponnesian War, about 415 BC, in Athens, it was made a very serious crime, basically a treason in, English-speaking terms, to propagate any astronomical theories in Athens. So, that's pretty interesting. Now, this is just maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 years before Socrates is executed and everything. And obviously, he could have just been banished and everything, so who knows? But it's just very interesting that astronomical theories couldn't be propagated either. They did not want any ideas that would make them think about distances of time and space. And I'd say, compare that with like flat earthers though today, because I think that's a lot of what's motivating all these different flat earth theories is trying to minimize the distance of the world, trying to make everything a bit smaller so you can feel a bit bigger. So I don't know, but I think there might be a bit of a parallel there. And so on to the next. He speaks of Thucydides, and that Thucydides is only good when he's speaking about his own personal experience, because he was a general and a diplomat, a politician. but he doesn't really have a historical sense proper. And remember, Spengler thinks that all of classical culture is ahistoric, so it would be very anomalous for any classical historian to have a historical sense proper, as Spengler calls it. And he thinks maybe even only the West could develop such a thing, and that's kind of because he thinks only his method is a good way to go about history. But he thinks, a real historical sense proper is a perspective, a survey of centuries, not just about one war, and not even the whole war. Not even the whole war, because Thucydides passed away before the end of the Peloponnesian War. I believe Xenophon is the big source for the later portions of the war. And And then Greek attempts to adopt the Egyptian calendar he calls belated and naive. So here's another aspect where the Greeks just weren't that concerned. The classical cultures just weren't that concerned with mapping things out on some continuous timeline. It's just the pure present contrasted with the mythological past. And this mythological past is just polar in Spengler's conception. I'm not sure, to what extent this truly describes classical thought, but it's certainly persuasive. But so they take up the calendar in a belated and naive way, and he calls the Greek conception of history childlike fairy story, and he gives an example of a treaty where they signed this treaty and they said it was to be in effect for 100 years from the date of this treaty, but they didn't date the treaty, and nobody really, no, they said 100 years from this year, but it's very difficult to say what year is what, because they tried with the Olympiad, the 4-year cycles, a little bit later, and that's what he's talking about with the belated and naive attempt to adopt the Egyptian calendar. But, so it's just kind of curious, especially from our point of view, that they don't have a strong time sense. And I don't know, there's some of it's attractive to us, right? That's part of why all these different Indian spiritual traditions have grown in popularity vastly in the West over the last 60 years or so. And that's because, and we're going to get to it pretty shortly, that the Indian soul is the most ahistoric soul in Spengler's view. And he cites as another piece of evidence for the ahistoric nature of the classical soul that the knowledge of African geography actually degenerated over the course of classical culture. So Herodotus, who just followed Persian sources, actually has a better geography of Africa than Aristotle, who tries to, improve on it, probably based on logic or whatever. His approach is pretty interesting. I mean, the 4 causes and everything. Anyway, so there's no distinction between history as a story versus history as documents for the classical society. It's all just this mythological story for them. And then he brings up this guy Varro, who's a late Roman Republic figure, who writes a book about the certain gods and the uncertain gods. So certain gods were gods that they were still praying to, that they still knew something about. And uncertain gods were gods that all knowledge had been lost about, but they still kept up the tradition. So, again, very curious to us. They would still do all these temple offerings and all the physical aspects, all the procedural aspects of offering sacrifices to this god, of worshiping this god. And they wouldn't know anything about this god at this point in time. They didn't. And it's just very, very interesting from our point of view that what was just important was kind of going through the motions in kind of both senses of that phrase, of worshiping at that place, at that specific place, because this is something Spengler highlights throughout as well, that kind of specific places and specific bodies are very important to the classical mind. And, anyway. So, and then he also mentions that these late Republic religions, even the certain religions in Varro's terms, those were more a product of Hellenistic literature than actually any ancient practices. So he thinks that pretty much all the Roman knowledge about their own gods was lost, and that they just kind of reincorporated this Hellenistic literature about the gods to explain the gods to themselves again, but it probably has no relation to the original gods. Now, who knows? I mean, both the Romans and the Greeks are Proto-Indo-European peoples. It looks very likely that there was a god very similar to Zeus for the Proto-Indo-European peoples. So the idea that both of them would have, Zeus Indra as well for the Indian culture. So the idea that maybe the classical and the Indian culture have a united source of their ahistoricity of their soul, the fact that they don't emphasize history, and maybe they have this common source for their gods, Indra and Zeus. And that the second part, Indra and Zeus, that's pretty well documented. The other, that's much more speculative, whether they both have ahistoric souls. But there's a very intuitive truth to it. It has persuasive force. And he also contrasts the Greek reversion to wood between 1200 and 600 BC with other cultures that preferred to build out of stone. And finally, he contrasts the fact that the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Mesoamerican culture, so like Mayan culture and maybe the pre-culture, and then Aztecs finished that culture off. He thought so Egyptians, Babylonians, Mesoamerican culture, Chinese culture, they all had a script basically at the dawn of the culture. Now, I don't actually know how true that is, because his knowledge of Chinese history is very interesting, his interpretation of it, but and he's writing this in the 19-teens and 1920s, early 1920s, so it's tough to say because there's far less archaeological evidence had been found at that time, although significant progress had been made, obviously. But, the early dynasties, I'm thinking of like the Shang dynasty, They had characters, but they were very strange, and yeah, I think, it's been a while since I took Chinese history, but yeah, I mean, I guess it was mostly on oracle bones. Yeah, like all their writing was done on these oracle bones, so I think Spengler would have been fascinated by that, because he would have seen that as kind of this birth of this religious feeling in response to world fear and death fear in the Chinese civilization or Chinese culture at this point. So it's just interesting, and maybe he is right, because there certainly was the writing that led to Chinese characters on these oracle bones. So they were, they'd do these ceremonies to try to predict the future and, write some stuff on them. And the oracle bones would be like the scapula of like an ox. So you take the ox's shoulder blade and then you try to predict the future with it, as broadly as I can put the matter. So anyway, on to the fifth main point of this. Indian culture has a perfectly ahistoric soul, in Spengler's view. And the decisive expression is the Brahman nirvana. Now, he doesn't elaborate that here. Maybe he elaborates that further, because I'm not quite sure how he means that. Maybe trying to get this unity between, Atman and Brahman. I think it's your own Atman, and I don't know exactly. Some sort of panpsychism stuff. So he says the organic phase of Indian culture came to an end with Buddhism. And this is obviously very surprising, because Buddhism is basically considered one of the kind of hallmarks of Indian culture, the real landmarks of Indian history. But he thinks that Buddhism is the form of Indian nihilism. So he thinks every culture, basically on the brink of its civilization phase, a guy comes around, and and it's not really important who it is. Like, that's a very big thing with Spengler, is that it's all about what's the right moment and what's the right form expression for that culture at that moment. And so he thinks each culture is going to have its own nihilism. So for us, that's somewhat nihilism, but it's a broader phenomenon of different socialisms. So he would even view utilitarianism as a form of socialism, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. He thinks that's the Faustian nihilism. So this is something that denies the initial religiousness, the ultimate religious idea of the culture, but it's also kind of what the civilized expression, and civilized is kind of pejorative in Spengler's sense, and it's what the civilized expression of the world feeling of that culture would be. So for the Faustian, because we want to be infinite force spreading into infinite space, and we want to understand things down to the most infinitesimal detail, and we want to be able to send our monuments down the ages for all time, like with something like the Voyager. Those were a pretty good bit of evidence in favor of Spengler's view. So those would have been shot off, fired into space, I believe, about like 1980. So that's 45 years after Spengler's dead. And he would have, that's kind of the ultimate Faustian expression. We're shooting off information about ourselves outside of the solar system as far as we can get, just so that someone somewhere who probably can never even arrive at the Earth might know that we existed. I don't know, kind of charming in its way, poetic certainly. And so anyway, infinite force moving into infinite space, that's the Faustian Western prime symbol. And he's not discussing that just yet. I'm giving you this kind of preview because I'm on a big tangent here. So, so he thinks our nihilism has to be some kind of a variation on that. So you think about it, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now it's not a personal striving and a personal battling with the infinite, a personal battling with spiritual forces. Now it's just this material of, we need to give everybody, as equal as possible, and as much as possible of the prosperity that Western science has developed, basically, and Western entrepreneurialism, because the science doesn't mean too much until somebody has the genius to apply it in a way that's repeatable and that is cost effective and all that. You look throughout history at all these other cultures that have developed technologies but did not realize nearly as much of their potential as Western culture has. And we're probably still not realizing as much potential as already all the existing technology that we have, in terms of bringing it together and all that. Now, if you define technique broadly as Spengler does, maybe that's not yet within our technological capacity, because in one sense, making the connection is that form of innovation, right? Like, suitcases existed for a long, long time, and wheels existed for a few thousand years. And then when did you start to see wheeled luggage? It happened sometime in the 20th century. That's a Nassim Nicholas Taleb example. So anyway, so the Indian culture, it's a perfectly ahistoric soul, and he brings some more evidence for that. And the Indian ahistoricity is best expressed by the fact that they didn't even write any histories. The only history about India that we get prior to foreign cultures arriving onto the Indian subcontinent in Spengler's conception, because obviously even the Indic peoples, the quote-unquote Aryans, because that's how they refer to themselves in the Rig Veda and the Avesta, I believe, The Avesta is a Persian work, but they were both Aryans. That's the Aryan branch of the Proto-Indo-European language family. So they obviously came and conquered the Punjab somewhere around there pretty early. But Spengler doesn't think this is a culture yet, because he thinks the culture will only arise once that world feeling, once that prime symbol develops to deal with world fear and death fear, and that it's going to slowly come into this, kind of inchoate form in the waking consciousness, as if they're waking up from a dream. And we'll get to the part where he eventually says this. I forget exactly where it is in the book. So, yeah, and also all of Indian philosophy is anonymous. The idea of a single person writing a book at any certain point in time is basically a foreign concept to the Indian culture. So we've got quite a bit of evidence that they really do have an ahistoric soul. And he says the Indian forgot everything, but the Egyptian forgot nothing. And he says the Egyptian, he uses the evidence of the portraiture of the Egyptians, which he says is like a biography in kernel. So portraiture would basically be... Well, it's funny because he says it's biography in kernel, and I guess because there were Egyptian biographies, but to say portraiture is biography in kernel is also to imply some sort of linear progression between the two, that portraiture is kind of a more archaic or a more visceral, kind of a more immediately sensuous art of biography, and that would develop earlier in the past, and contrasting that with biography, which would be a more well-developed, more internal, less superficial, less imagistic, obviously, and everything. So, we'll get into it later when he really starts sounding very much like a postmodernist. We might want to think back to here, where it kind of sounds like he's talking about portraiture almost as an earlier stage in this bit of technics, as he would say, in technology and art than biography. So we can just put that to one side for now. And he says the Egyptian soul was impelled with primitive passion toward the infinite. So I thought that was kind of interesting, obviously very politically incorrect to say something like that. But I think there's truth to it, and obviously the Egyptians that he's speaking about are very archaic from our point of view, and we owe them a great debt because they're probably, in my view, they're the first kind of great civilization, but I guess the Sumerians might actually have them beat in a little bit of a way, but certainly the fact that the pyramids still exist, and, it's all pretty amazing. Anyway, the Egyptian culture is the embodiment of care, he says. And he says care is the spiritual counterpoise of distance. So this is interesting, because the Egyptians, he says, cared a lot. And by that he means they mummified themselves, they really cared about the future. I mean, all that. And maybe as a materialist you might say, well, that's because of the Nile floods, and maybe Spengler would agree to some degree, because he thinks the land that any culture develops on has a very important effect on that culture. As I've said, he kind of has this kind of like terroir theory of the land's effect on a culture. So maybe he would go along with that, but he would just say, you can't explain it all with the materialism of the Nile flood cycles and all that. But he just views them as caring a lot about the future. And he views this as the spiritual counterpoise of distance. So maybe the classical and the Indian cultures would be distant in that sense, in their ahistoricity. It's kind of funny because they distance themselves from what's distant from them, in a sense, right? to focus on this pure present. So it's just an interesting thing to think of. And he says the Egyptian mummy is a symbol of the first importance, so we've pretty much touched on that. And he sees a deep relation between the attitude to the historic past and the disposal of the dead. And that makes perfect sense. I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that, even though that's not a proposition you can really falsify and test empirically. I don't see much reason to quibble there. And then he contrasts Egyptian mummification with classical funeral pyres. So with the mummy, you've got the most intense form of trying to preserve yourself. And even today, you can still kind of see the faces of the mummified Egyptian pharaohs. And he had a very poetic way of saying about, or I guess he said kind of pathetic in kind of an archaic meaning, because if you say pathetic today, obviously it has the very, very negative connotation, but he just means it in the sense of pathos, that seeing these mummies in our museums today really affects us with a lot of pathos, a lot of emotion. And that's opposed to the Greek practice of cremation of these funeral pyres, and he sees that as really affirming the pure present, affirming their mortality, instead of trying to negate it with mummification and these other attempts at immortality, like carving on all these gigantic stone reliefs and everything. And another piece of evidence he sees that shows that the classical soul was ahistoric is the fact that before Solon's a very important lawgiver. I believe he lived in Ionia. So Ionia is the part of the ancient Greek world on the western part, kind of the southwestern part of Anatolia. A lot of the nicest places in Turkey are where Ionia used to be. Ionia was like prime real estate and was almost the center of the Greek world in a lot of ways. You know, obviously we think of the Greek mainland as more important and more actually being Greece, because that's where the modern country is, just on that peninsula. But at that time, there were Greek colonies, you know, as far as Massalia, Marseille today, and up into the Black Sea, you know, basically on like the Ukrainian steppe up there. And so they were all over, but they had tons of land in what is today Turkey. I mean, the Turks were nowhere near the scene. The Turks might have not even been an ethnic group at this time. I'm not sure about their ethnogenesis, but they developed out of the steppe. I think they were somewhere east of the Altai Mountains. I think they were up like where the Mongols are. I mean, very far eastern steppe, but they ended up fighting their way all the way through Central Asia and then over to Anatolia, and that's why you got places like Turkmenistan and stuff like that. And this is a recurring pattern in history. You just have steppe invaders over and over again coming in and conquering these civilized areas and then kind of becoming conquered by them. So that's another question. How did nomads kind of fit into Spengler's perspective? And we'll learn some more about that. The funny thing is he really thinks of the Vikings as like the first nomads, whereas I view them, or those are the first, what do I want to say, like long distance raiding peoples that he thinks of, because the Vikings really weren't like nomadic, because they had home bases where they, but I don't know, if you think about like pastoral nomadism, even that, you know, it's not like you're just going all around the world. I mean, you have certain places you go. Sometimes you just have a seasonal pattern and things like that and whatever. But yeah, it's just a recurring pattern that you get tons of nomadic peoples from Central Asia who conquer areas in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East again and again, and then assimilate with those people by and large. Anyway, so that's all from trying to discuss Solon, who was a big lawgiver. He's most famous well, he's famous for a lot of mythical stuff, who even knows if he really existed. And, or actually, no, Solon was from Athens, wasn't he? He sure was. I think I was thinking of Thales of Miletus. So he was like a great inventor back in the day. Taleb really likes him, so he would be big in my mind. But yeah, so the Greek world was, had it going on back then and was a very interesting place. And, but they didn't even have any documents until sometime after 600 BC. So this is what he's saying. They were really ahistoric because he views them as already being at a high cultural point by 600 BC, certainly being in their spring, maybe being even into their summer. So yeah, this is something I like, is that he recognizes that cultures can develop without literature and with just an oral culture, which is something probably too many modern researchers might not prioritize, maybe, but who knows? And then he compares the lack of pre-Solon documents to the exact Egyptian chronologies from the 3rd millennium BC, right at the beginning of their culture. And I just thought that was pretty good piece of evidence for his hypothesis that maybe it's just a thesis, really, because it can't be subjected to empirical scrutiny in a fully rigorous way, maybe. But he is trying to expose it to some empirical rigor through these analogies, and that's where I think he's really strong, and that's why I like this work so much. So yeah, that's about it. Thinks the Greek soul, the classical soul, is very ahistoric, because he's trying to answer this question, for whom is their history? And he answers only those high cultures that have a historic soul. So not even all the high cultures are going to have history. And in his view, the Indian and the classical really don't. They don't have a world history. They don't have a scheme of history or a plan of history. To the extent those differ, who knows? But he views his as this plan according to his analogical comparative morphology, instead of a systematic, Kantian attempt to understand the whole world, front and back through your book, basically, right? So anyway, I'm sorry for all the rambling again. I was getting better there for a lot of them, in a sense, at staying on track a little bit better, but trying to record late at night, and what can I say? It has some effect. But if you're still with me now, I hope you've enjoyed, and I thank you so much for your time and your attention. You have an awesome day. Thanks so much. Have a great one. Peace.